The world of professional wrestling is full of tragic stories. Many of us have heard the most famous ones, at least if they originate in the West. But over its more than 70 years of modern history, pro wrestling in Japan has had more than its own fair share of tragedy. These are three obscure, disturbing incidents to emerge from Japanese pro wrestling. Incidents that didn't happen in a ring in front of a crowd, but took place behind closed doors and are still largely shrouded in mystery. We'll start off with a truly sad incident that took place over 10 years ago. It's the vicious backstage assault on a veteran pro wrestler, the resulting police investigation and subsequent political disgrace of members of All Japan Pro Wrestling. It happened May 29, 2011 in Kobe, when 42-year-old wrestler Nobukazu Hirai collapsed backstage after a match. He was vomiting blood and rushed to the hospital, where he slipped into a coma and had to be put on a ventilator to breathe. But it wasn't from anything that happened in the ring that night, because prior to that match, Hirai was assaulted and beaten backstage by two other wrestlers, most famously Yoshikazu Taru. It took place behind closed doors in a dressing room at the venue, Kobe Sambo Hall. And despite a handful of people being directly involved, exact details on the assault are largely unconfirmed. In subsequent press conferences, Taru reveals very little details about the assault itself, and the victim, Hirai, seems to have never disclosed them publicly either. So I'm going to give you the best timeline of events possible based on reporting done at the time by Japanese newspapers like Tokyo Sports and Nikon Sports. On May 29, 2011, at about 2 p.m., Hirai entered the venue along with the other members of an AJPW faction called the Voodoo Murders. The event scheduled for that night was a televised card in front of a small crowd of less than 1,000 people. The Voodoo Murderers had their own private dressing room, and shortly after arriving, the faction leader Taru apparently told all of the Gaijin or non-Japanese wrestlers to leave. Left behind were Taru himself, the victim Hirai, and three other members of the Voodoo Murderers, Kono, Mazada, and Minoru. The door to the dressing room is then closed and yelling can be heard behind it. Taru can allegedly be heard screaming the phrase, "Bring me the iron pipe," which, according to Tokyo Sports, is actually a regional expression that means "I'm going to beat you up." This is reportedly where the physical assault on Hirai began, and Taru started punching him. It seems like other wrestlers at the venue are aware that something is going on behind that door, and after an unspecified amount of time goes by, it's referee Kyohei Wada who intervenes to stop the violence. In most accounts of this incident that you read online, it's Taru who is painted as the primary perpetrator of the attack, with Mazada, Kono, and Minoru usually accused of failing to intervene and help Hirai, but not necessarily participate in the beating. This would change later on, but we'll get to that. Rene Dupree was one of the foreigners who was sent out of the room before the assault began, but he says when he returned to the Voodoo Murderers' dressing room, he saw Hirai clutching his face and other members of the faction wiping blood off the walls. Now remember, Hirai was still scheduled to wrestle in a matter of hours, and according to a report from Japanese newspaper Nikon Sports, he was asked by officials prior to that match if he was okay to compete, to which he apparently responded, quote, "I'm fine." One of the stranger twists here is that Taru and Hirai were stablemates in that Voodoo Murderers group, and that Taru actually accompanied Hirai to the ring for his match that night. On his podcast, which is called Café de René, Rene Dupree says that after his match that night, Hirai sat down, threw up, and went into convulsions. He was rushed to the hospital shortly after. At the hospital, it was determined that Hirai had suffered a subdural hematoma, the same serious brain injury that Katsuyori Shibata suffered after his infamous headbutt. He was operated on for 3 hours, during which time medical staff at Kobe University had to perform a craniotomy, brain surgery. On top of all of that, Hirai suffered a stroke, went into a coma, and had to be put on a ventilator to breathe. He did, however, survive. The actual reason for the attack isn't explicitly known. No Japanese source or first-hand account seems to have definitive bulletproof knowledge of this, and Taru himself is vague on the subject. But there are rumors and allegations. Nikon Sports, for example, claimed that a dispute erupted between the two as a result of a, quote, business problem that occurred during the Kyushu series in May, end quote. According to the now defunct wrestling website armpitwrestling.com, the conflict between the two men could have also been about Hirai's alleged alcoholism and his poor work in the ring. I even found a Yahoo Japan post from 2017 that speculated that Hirai may have accused Taru of misusing donation funds he was soliciting after the 2011 tsunami. But I could find no official source that could substantiate these claims. And there's another wrinkle to this story I haven't mentioned yet. One Japanese news article I found claimed that Hirai was already suffering from a headache as a result of injuries sustained in a match prior to the assault. Not the one that he had directly afterward, but one that took place a week before. And the Armpit Wrestling blog goes a step further, claiming that before the incident with Taru, Hirai took a bad chair shot in a match with Kenzo Suzuki, one that required stitches. For anyone unfamiliar with the Voodoo Murderers, by the way, it's a heel group that has a kind of satanic grunge vibe to it, with members sometimes painting their faces and wearing a lot of black leather. Let's also take a moment to have a look at who Nobukazu Hirai actually was, and his career up until this tragic incident. Hirai debuted in the short-lived Super World Sports promotion, a Japanese wrestling company founded by the legendary Genichiro Tenryu. He was a second-generation wrestler, with his father Mitsu Hirai performing in All Japan in the 1970s. After Super World Sports folded, Hirai followed Tenryu to his new promotion, Wrestle and Romance, or WAR, and remained there for the 1990s. Now, to be honest, there isn't much to note about his career at this point, but it might interest some of you to know that he did wrestle WWF talent during that company's 1994 Japanese tour. After WAR shut its doors in 2000, Hirai jumped over to the company his father wrestled in, All Japan Pro Wrestling, a company that also happened to be desperate for talent in the wake of the devastating pro wrestling Noah exodus. He originally turned heel and joined the Voodoo Murderers in 2008, after which he started wearing full face makeup and using a fire extinguisher as a weapon. As a member of the Voodoo Murderers group, Hirai was going by the name Super Hate at the time of this incident. Now, as for Taru, his career started a few years later, but also in Genichiro Tenryu's WAR, which means the two had known each other in some professional capacity 15 years prior to the incident. Taru moved on to Ultimo Dragon's Torimon promotion in the late 90s. There, his career progressed significantly as he changed his presentation style from a straight-laced shooter to more of a cartoonish heel. In 2005, he would make the jump to All Japan, where he'd form the Voodoo Murderers faction. Now that we know a little bit more about the main personalities involved, let's get back to the incident. On June 1st of 2011, a press conference was held, where Taru admitted to assaulting Hirai backstage, expressed remorse for it, and stepped away from wrestling, apparently voluntarily. Now, some sources from the time do make it seem like he was forcefully suspended by All Japan, but because of the language barrier, it's hard to tell exactly. The three other men in the room during the assault, Minoru, Kono, and Mazada, were suspended as well, and Voodoo Murderers as a faction was disbanded, at least for the time being. It was also confirmed that Hirai was still in a coma at that point, and reported that talks between Hirai's family and Taru regarding a legal settlement might have begun. At these press conferences, the assault itself seems to be played down to a degree, with Taru talking about punching Hirai a few times and not remembering who else was in the room and what they were doing at the time. This sort of minimizing of events seems to directly contradict the severity of Hirai's injuries and some gruesome first-hand reports obtained by Tokyo Sports. Now, once this whole situation did get out into the press, it became mainstream news in Japan, and pressure on All Japan Pro Wrestling to make some kind of move in response was mounting. By June 7th, a few weeks after the initial incident, AJPW President Keiji Muto apologized, took responsibility, and resigned from his presidential position. For those unaware, Keiji Muto was at the time and still is a living legend in Japanese pro wrestling. A megastar of the 1990s in New Japan, he reinvented himself in the early 2000s and took on the real-life presidency of All Japan. And whatever you think of his booking style or how he handled the company, Muto was a lifeline for them at a time when they were struggling just to stay on life support. So to say his departure from this role was a big deal might be a bit of an understatement. But what about Taru? Would there be any consequences for him beyond that initial suspension? Well, after Keiji Muto resigned, the news surrounding this incident did go quiet for several months. That was until November 22nd, when a major update broke. Taru and fellow Voodoo Murderers stablemate Mazada had been arrested on suspicion of assault. In December, the pair were released from police custody and ordered to pay fines, 300,000 yen for Taru and 200,000 yen for Mazada. That is about $3,800 and $2,500 respectively, using the exchange rate from December 2011. So what happened? Well, according to an article from Nikkon Sports at the time, there may not have been enough evidence for police to tie Harai's injury to the backstage assault, and thus the two arrested wrestlers were forced just to pay fines. This arrest also marks the first time that anyone else except Taru was accused of assaulting Harai. According to a Japanese news and entertainment website called Real Live, Mazada revealed a different version of events than what we had heard from Taru at an apology press conference. I'm going to read you the full paragraph from their article on this, but keep in mind it's been auto-translated from Japanese. Quote, Mazada held an apology press conference and told the full story of the assault incident, which had not been disclosed until now. According to Mazada, Taru and Harai got into an argument before the match and started punching each other, so 3 people, including Mazada, intervened to stop the fight. Still, the two were getting excited, so Mazada calmed Harai down by giving him 2 slaps with his palm. After that, there was another argument, and when Mazada stopped the incident, a senior in the industry came in and warned them, and the situation was brought under control. End quote. And as far as mainstream news was concerned, this was more or less the end of the saga. So where are all these people now? Well, Mazada's suspension from AJPW was lifted and he's still wrestling today. He was part of Keiji Muto's Wrestle 1 promotion until it folded in 2020, and he even had a place on the card for Muto's big retirement show in the Tokyo Dome in 2023. When it comes to Taru, he also returned to the ring. 2 years after the incident with All Japan, he emerged from a career hiatus and joined Diamond Ring, an independent promotion founded by Kensuke Sasaki. After Diamond Ring folded, he moved on to Pro Wrestling 01. There are a few sources out there that claim that he and Harai have made peace with each other. A now-defunct wrestling blog called Pro Res Spirit, for example, alleges that Taru visited Harai and his family after the injury many times, and that there's no real issue remaining between them. And as for poor Nobukazu Harai, I wish I had more information about his current status. By November of 2011, it was reported that as he was recovering, Harai had regained consciousness, was moved to a general ward in the hospital, and was able to speak from time to time. According to a Japanese entertainment and news website called Saizo, as of 2013, Harai was well on the road to recovery and even had hopes of one day wrestling again. Unfortunately, that now 10-year-old article is the most up-to-date information I could find on Harai's status. He is alive, but has not returned to wrestling. And at this point, for his own good, let's hope that he never does. If there is any kind of silver lining to the Voodoo Murderers incident, it's that Nobukazu Harai survived and is hopefully living a full and happy life. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the next story we'll cover in this video. It's the story of Giant Ochiai and his untimely death while training to become a pro wrestler. If you've never heard the name Giant Ochiai, it's probably because his wrestling career never got the chance to really happen. His real name was Takayuki Okada. That ring name was one part a reference to his famous baseball-playing uncle, Hiromitsu Gompei, and one part a reference to his rather large 6'1", 290-pound frame. Ochiai was an MMA fighter first, but one who always had a flair for theatrics and possessed a certain charisma, famously sporting oversized sunglasses and an afro wig to the ring for his fights. With a background in judo, in the late 90s he started competing in an organization called Shuto, an MMA promotion founded by Satoru Sayama, the original Tiger Mask. Speaking of going pro, from 2000 to 2003, he fought in Pride, eventually racking up a professional record of 3 wins, 3 losses, and 2 draws. And at the same time, he started to dabble in pro wrestling, specifically with the shoot-style promotion Battlarts. This was a time when the line between legit MMA competition and worked pro wrestling bouts was still kind of blurry in Japan. Athletes from both areas often crossed over into the other. Sometimes real fights were fixed, and sometimes the simulated wrestling matches got a little too real. So a guy like Ochiai, who was a heavyweight with a legit MMA background and plenty of charisma, would have fit in perfectly with the landscape of Japanese wrestling at the time. Ochiai eventually decided to make a go of pro wrestling in a more serious way and signed up with the short-lived World Japan promotion in 2003. World Japan was the brainchild of the legendary Riki Choshu, who himself was hot off a messy exit from New Japan. Ochiai entered the World Japan dojo looking for an education in pro wrestling. What he got was something very different. On August 8, 2003, it was suddenly announced that Ochiai had died during an unspecified training accident after some time in a coma. He was just 30 years old. Apparently, it happened while he was training under a wrestler named Kenzo Suzuki in July. An accident of some kind occurred, and Ochiai was rushed to the hospital. According to the wrestling website Ring the Damn Bell, an autopsy revealed he died of the result of a subdural hematoma. If that sounds familiar, that's because it's the same condition Nobukazu Hirai suffered and indicates severe head trauma. There's something else these two incidents have in common as well, a very strange coincidence. Ochiai was training under Kenzo Suzuki, who also happened to be the final wrestling opponent of Hirai before he too slipped into a coma and nearly lost his life. As far as what exactly happened in the dojo and the nature of the accident, almost no real information exists online. World Japan itself was vague and brief about the situation, and it doesn't appear that criminal charges were ever filed. Unfortunately, nearly 20 years after the incident first occurred, we still don't really know what happened. We do know, however, that there was some serious backlash from the Japanese media and public about how this situation was handled by the promotion and Choshu himself. And it seems plausible that Giant Ochiai's mysterious death could have been a contributing factor to the rapid decline and quick closure of World Japan. Kenzo Suzuki would leave Japan and work in America after the incident, and World Japan would shut its doors about a year later after numerous financial difficulties. But the story of Giant Ochiai is not the only time something like this happened, and it's not even the most infamous. That unfortunate designation likely belongs to the mysterious and tragic death of young lion Hiromitsu Gompei in 1995. Gompei was a collegiate champion and personally recruited into New Japan Pro Wrestling by Hiroshi Hase. Hase, of course, was already a major star in the promotion and soon to be a sitting politician in Japan's House of Councilors. As a rookie hopeful, Gompei was required to complete a training period in New Japan's dojo system and become a so-called young lion. A better term might be to survive it, because this training program did have a reputation for a certain level of brutality. According to what little information about this exists online, Hase had to personally convince Gompei's parents to allow him to train in the dojo, vouching for his safety and his prosperity. Unfortunately, even reassurances from a company star like Hase wouldn't be enough to prevent what happened next. On January 26, 1995, Gompei was severely injured while training at the dojo. He reportedly sustained a major head injury, was taken to hospital, and died 4 days later. The death of Gompei happened under the watch of Kensuke Sasaki. You might know Sasaki from his work in WCW throughout the years, or for being one of the guys in the most brutal chop war in wrestling history. He went on to become a legitimate star in multiple promotions in the 90s onward. Like the Giant Ochiai incident, we don't know 100% definitively what happened behind closed doors that led to the end of Gompei's life. But unlike the Ochiai situation, we do have some accounts and alleged details. According to a book called Ring of Hell by Matthew Randazzo, Sasaki was conducting training that day when he became angry with Gompei, allegedly after he wasn't performing his workout up to standards during a visit by Riki Choshu. Choshu himself was the trainer and mentor of Sasaki. According to the book, Sasaki allegedly took his anger out on the 22-year-old trainee, which led to Gompei's injuries. This account of the incident is based on sources Randazzo interviewed for his book that only spoke on condition of anonymity. And it's only one version of the story that's out there. Some versions say that while Sasaki was overseeing training that day, he wasn't the one in the ring with Gompei when he was injured, or that Sasaki in fact rushed to help Gompei when some kind of accident occurred. It seems that no criminal charges were ever brought forth in relation to Gompei's death. In fact, there is very little information about Hiromitsu Gompei the person available online. I couldn't even find a picture of him. Now, remember when I said Hiroshi Hase supposedly recruited Gompei and convinced his parents to let him join New Japan's training system? Well, the common narrative online is that after the death of Gompei, Hase left New Japan in disgust. Apparently, the story goes, he tried to get answers from the company about what really happened and was given the runaround. But it also has to be said that Hase's political career began later that year, and he had good reason to step away from wrestling. Now, he did join up with rival company All Japan in 1997 in a sort of part-time capacity, but that was already 2 years after Gompei's death. If you're wondering why we know so little about some of these incidents, part of it is the language barrier and the lack of access to primary Japanese sources. But the other part is just the secretive nature of the pro wrestling dojo systems in Japan. They have a reputation for being grueling, physically and mentally punishing boot camps. They have their roots in sumo dojos, where allegations of abuse and scandal and even death are not unheard of, and perhaps not even uncommon. These are closed-off training centers where the general public aren't even allowed to enter or look into on a given day. So unless criminal charges end up getting filed, it's sometimes just not possible to find definitive, unbiased information that's public on these kind of incidents.